They robbed trains, held up banks, and vanished into the dust before the law could catch its breath. In the lawless corners of the American frontier, there existed a place whispered about by lawmen and bandits alike, a hidden outlaw sanctuary where six-shooters ruled and justice rarely made the trip. Known only in hushed tones as Bandit Heaven, it was more legend than location, a mythical hideout where the West's most notorious outlaws could regroup, reload, and ride again. But who were the men that ruled over this criminal paradise? They weren't just thieves. They were icons, folk heroes, and in some cases, cold-blooded killers who became the stuff of dime novels and campfire stories. This video takes you deep into the stories of the legendary outlaws who didn't just survive the Wild West, they ran it. If you love tales of daring getaways, infamous gunslingers, and the true grit of Old West outlaws, hit that subscribe button and saddle up. There's a lot more where this came from. John Wesley Hardin. In the course of my research and writing, I've encountered a range of colorful figures from the Old West, individuals whose complex personalities often blurred the line between heroism and villainy. Among them are individuals who, despite their often ruthless actions, left behind legacies that would become woven into the fabric of Western folklore. One such figure is John Wesley Hardin, a man whose reputation was shaped as much by his actions as by the stories he himself told. Hardin, only 18 years old at the time, claimed to have outdrawn Wild Bill Hickok in a famous confrontation in Abilene, Kansas in 1871. The truth of this encounter remains the subject of much debate, but it's clear that Hardin's violent path was already well underway by then. His reign of terror, however, didn't start in Abilene. It began years earlier, in his native Texas. Hardin's first brush with violence occurred at just 15, when he killed a classmate in a schoolyard brawl. This incident was only the beginning. His notorious reputation as a gunslinger began to take shape as he engaged in numerous altercations, each one adding to his myth. A defining phrase attributed to Hardin, "I never killed a man who didn't need killing," reflects his view of himself as an enforcer of his own brand of justice. Though the line between self-justification and cold-blooded violence remains a gray area in his legacy. By 1871, Hardin had already killed several men, his six-shooters being his primary means of asserting control over situations. In one of his most infamous encounters, Hardin found himself at odds with a group of Mexican cowboys at the end of a cattle drive along the Chisholm Trail near Abilene. Tensions escalated when Hardin accused the cowboys of crowding his herd, and what might have been a simple dispute quickly turned into a larger confrontation. According to accounts, 6 men were killed in this altercation, with Hardin claiming responsibility for 5 of the deaths. This event only solidified his reputation as a man willing to resort to deadly force when he felt provoked. Upon arriving in Abilene, Hardin ran into Wild Bill Hickok, who was serving as the town's marshal at the time. Despite Hardin's notoriety and the arrest warrants waiting for him in Texas, Hickok, known for his unflinching demeanor, seemed largely indifferent to the charges. However, Hickok did enforce Abilene's strict no-gun ordinance. When Hardin arrived in town, the lawmen confronted him about carrying weapons in the town limits. In a famous moment, Hardin reportedly surrendered his pistols after a maneuver he later called a road agent's spin. Hardin described it in his autobiography, explaining that as he reached for his guns, he deliberately reversed them and spun them towards Hickok with the muzzles facing the marshal. Hickok, seemingly unperturbed by the gesture, responded with calm amusement, offering Hardin a simple invitation to join him at the nearest saloon, but without his pistols. This encounter between the two men would become one of the many legends surrounding Hardin, who, despite his youthful age, had already carved out a significant place in Old West lore. Hardin's life, as recounted in his own words and those of others, reflects a mixture of bravado, self-aggrandizement, and an unyielding belief in his own sense of justice. His actions, while controversial, also shed light on the broader culture of violence and lawlessness that defined much of the American frontier in the late 19th century. Clay Allison, One of the lesser-known yet equally notorious figures of the Old West was Clay Allison. In Wild West Characters, author Dale Pierce paints a vivid picture of this enigmatic individual, describing him as a man whose erratic nature made him both unpredictable and dangerous. Hailing from Tennessee, Allison was not just a skilled gunman, but someone whose life was marked by a series of strange, impulsive decisions. He had a reputation for heavy drinking and a notorious affinity for the company of women from the underbelly of society, often frequenting saloons and brothels. However, it was his unpredictable and often baffling behavior, ranging from erratic violence to moments of erratic kindness, that truly set him apart from other figures of the time. Allison's life was filled with moments of lawlessness and reckless behavior, but one event in particular stands out as a defining moment of his notoriety. In the summer of 1878, he arrived in Dodge City with one goal in mind: to confront Wyatt Earp, the assistant marshal of the town. The cause of his anger was deeply personal. Allison blamed Earp for the death of a close friend, George Hoy, and felt that justice had not been served. This event would soon become one of the more infamous moments in Earp's own history. What made Allison's attempt to confront Earp even more remarkable was the preparation he took beforehand. Fearing that his attempt to confront Earp might fail, Allison brought along several cowboys as backup, planning for a deadly confrontation if things escalated. However, when the moment came and the two men met, it did not unfold as Allison had imagined. Upon locking eyes with Earp, Allison seemed to hesitate, struck by the lawman's cold, steely gaze. The encounter, which could have led to violence, instead diffused quickly. As Earp walked down the street, prepared for the worst, the situation began to unravel. Allison and his companions, who had planned an ambush, found themselves facing a much more formidable force than they had anticipated. Enter Bat Masterson, the Ford County Sheriff, who quietly approached the scene, shotgun in hand. Masterson's unexpected arrival had a profound effect on Allison's group. With Masterson in the picture and Earp's unshaken composure, the cowboys accompanying Allison wisely decided to retreat, climbing onto their horses and leaving Dodge City without further incident. The story of Clay Allison is one of many in the Old West that reflect the unpredictable nature of frontier justice. Like many figures from this period, Allison's life was a mix of violence, fear, and moments of surprising restraint. Belle Starr. While still in the heart of southwest Kansas, let's recall an intriguing moment in the life of the notorious bandit Belle Starr, a woman whose reputation in the Old West was as bold as her exploits. At the time, Belle and her husband, Sam Starr, were between heists, taking a brief respite in town. They had recently pulled off a bank job, and the couple was looking to unwind before the next criminal endeavor. However, the peace was short-lived. Sam, unable to resist temptation, slipped away to the Long Branch Saloon, hoping for a little luck at the gambling tables. When he eventually returned to their boarding house, his face was crimson with frustration. He admitted to Belle that he had lost $2,000 of their stolen money they could not afford to lose. For Belle, this was more than a mere loss of cash. It was a challenge to her pride and to her control over their criminal activities. Sam knew there was only one way to fix the situation. Without hesitation, Belle set off toward the saloon. Her approach was nothing short of dramatic. Armed and determined, she entered the establishment, where the patrons likely assumed they were about to witness another routine gambling night. But they were wrong. Belle moved confidently through the room, her eyes scanning the tables where men were placing their bets. And without a word, she began to take back what had been lost. With each step, she gathered the winnings from the tables and even directly from the pockets of the gamblers. It was a swift, almost theatrical act of retribution that left the onlookers stunned into silence. Once Belle had gathered the money, she calmly exited the saloon, her husband following closely behind. Together, they rode off into the sunset, their pockets now filled with a $7,000 haul, $5,000 more than they had started with. In a single afternoon, they had managed to turn a loss into a profitable gain, and once again, Belle's star had proven that she was not just a bandit, but a shrewd operator who knew how to turn a bad situation to her advantage. Johnny Ringo. It's possible in some cases to feel sympathy for an outlaw, particularly when one looks at the life of Johnny Ringo, the troubled cowboy who became a prominent figure during the turbulent years of Tombstone's heyday. Ringo's life was marked by personal tragedy from an early age. He struggled with depression throughout much of his life, a condition that likely shaped his violent and erratic behavior. One of the most traumatic experiences of his youth occurred when he witnessed his own father take his life while cleaning a shotgun, a moment that undoubtedly left lasting emotional scars. Ringo's path to notoriety began during the Mason County War in Texas, 1875, where he became involved in his first act of violence. This event marked the beginning of a pattern of bloodshed that would continue to haunt him throughout his life. Over the next several years, Ringo formed alliances with various outlaws, including Curly Bill Brocious, another figure associated with the lawless factions that were prevalent in Tombstone. Along with their cowboy gang, Ringo and Brocious found themselves intertwined with notorious ranching families such as the Clantons and McClorys, who often found themselves at odds with the law. However, Ringo's life was not as glamorous as his associations might suggest. In July 1882, Ringo's inner turmoil came to a head. By then, Curly Bill Brocious had been killed during the Earp Vendetta ride, and Ringo's remaining companions had either fled or scattered. The cowboy lifestyle in Cochise County, which had once held promise, was now crumbling. It was clear that the era of the cowboy was fading, and with it, Ringo's sense of purpose. Feeling isolated and defeated, Ringo saw no future in the world he had known. As his mental state deteriorated, Ringo, intoxicated and consumed by despair, took a drastic step. In a moment of deep depression, he raised his Colt .45 revolver to his head, signaling the tragic end to a troubled life. He was later discovered slumped against a tree, a victim of his own inner demons, Dave Rudabaugh. The idea that cleanliness is next to godliness, a concept popularized by preacher John Wesley in a 1791 sermon, seems to stand in stark contrast to the life of Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, a man whose disregard for personal hygiene matched his ruthless criminal career. Rudabaugh was notorious for his violent and relentless bank robberies, often leaving behind a trail of destruction and death. To him, the loss of life during his criminal escapades was an unfortunate but acceptable cost. In November 1880, Rudabaugh formed an alliance with the infamous Billy the Kid and his gang, marking a significant chapter in his life of crime. The duo's activities took them to White Oaks, New Mexico, where they killed a deputy sheriff. Their actions led to an intense manhunt, and Sheriff Pat Garrett, with the help of his posse, managed to corner the outlaws in a remote cabin near the aptly named Stinking Springs. Despite being captured, both Rudabaugh and Billy the Kid managed to escape from jail, continuing their lives of crime. However, Rudabaugh's time in the criminal world was rapidly coming to an end. After fleeing to Mexico, he found himself involved in a dispute with a poker player who accused him of cheating. In retaliation, Rudabaugh killed the man, a decision that would lead to his downfall. The player's friends, seeking revenge, tracked down Rudabaugh, and in a fittingly brutal turn of events, they not only ended his life but desecrated his body. His head was severed and paraded through town, an unsettling end for a man whose name had become synonymous with lawlessness. Rudabaugh's story is a tragic reflection of the brutal reality of the Old West, where violence and betrayal were common, and even the most notorious outlaws could meet grim fates. Tom Ketchum, Emmett Dalton, Wild Bunch Gang. As bold as Tom Blackjack Ketchum was, his punishment seemed extreme, even by the standards of the Old West. Ketchum, infamous for his outlaw ways, was apprehended and sentenced to death in New Mexico for the murder of a deputy sheriff. While he awaited his fate in prison, it seems that the conditions were relatively comfortable, as he gained a significant amount of weight during the lengthy appeals process. However, when the time came for his execution, an unfortunate mistake occurred. The executioner, using a rope that was far too long, caused a tragic and gruesome result when Ketchum's head was torn off shortly after the trapdoor opened. It's a grim reminder of how the sometimes hasty application of frontier justice could go awry. Not all outlaws met such a final and violent end, however. Some, like Emmett Dalton, were granted second chances. Dalton's first second chance came in October 1892, after he and his gang attempted a robbery in Coffeyville, Kansas. During this fateful encounter, Dalton was shot 23 times, but was the only member of his group to survive. Tragically, his brothers Bob and Grat were killed in the same shootout. Despite the odds stacked against him, Dalton recovered and went on to serve 14 years in prison. When he was eventually released, he didn't return to a life of crime. Instead, he reinvented himself as a real estate speculator and even a film producer, making movies about the very gang he had once led and the lawmen who had pursued him. Dalton's story is a rare example of an outlaw who not only survived his criminal past but also found success in an entirely different world. One of my personal favorites from my latest book, Bandit Heaven, is Harvey Logan, better known as Kid Curry, a member of the Wild Bunch. Curry, born in Iowa, started his career as a cowboy on a ranch in Texas before realizing that bank robberies were far more lucrative than the hardships of ranch life. His decision to join the ranks of outlaws marked the beginning of his notorious career. Over time, he earned a reputation as a dangerous and unpredictable man, ultimately becoming a trusted companion to Butch Cassidy, much like the Sundance Kid was. His life came to an end in a 1904 shootout in Colorado, where he met his demise after years of living by his own violent code. Big Nose George. If I were to choose a favorite outlaw, it would have to be George Big Beak Parrott, not so much for his criminal activities, but rather for the bizarre circumstances surrounding his afterlife. Parrott, infamous for his exploits as a bandit, primarily in Wyoming, had been a constant presence in the criminal underworld. His violent career, which culminated in the spring of 1881, ended abruptly when he was arrested for the murder of both a deputy sheriff and a Union Pacific detective. However, his life would not fade into history quietly. While Parrott's time in jail was short-lived, his fate became far stranger. In a bid to escape custody, he was seized by a vengeful mob and lynched. His story, however, was far from finished. Two physicians, Thomas Maggie and John Osborne, took an interest in Parrott's body and decided to conduct an experiment. They sought to examine his brain in an attempt to uncover the root cause of his criminal behavior. After they had removed the top of Parrott's skull for their study, they made an unusual decision. They gifted the skull cap to Lillian Heath, Dr. Maggie's assistant. At the time, Heath was just 16 years old, yet she would later make her own mark in history as Wyoming's first female physician. It's said that she used the outlaw's skull cap as an ashtray. The bizarre nature of the act only deepens the story of this man who would become more famous after his death than during his life. But the oddities didn't end with the skull cap. The doctors didn't just stop at studying Parrott's brain. They also removed skin from his thighs and chest, and this flesh was sent to a tannery in Denver. There, it was transformed into a medical bag and even a pair of shoes. These items would later hold an unexpected historical significance. Dr. Osborne, who went on to become Wyoming's first Democratic governor, wore the shoes to his inaugural ball in 1893, adding an unusual layer to the story of Parrott's remains. Meanwhile, Parrott's dismembered body remained in a whiskey barrel, suspended in a salt solution, for nearly a year while the physicians continued their studies. Eventually, he was buried behind Dr. Mackay's office, as though the crime and punishment surrounding his life and death had now reached their final resting point. Yet the body's journey did not stop there. In 1950, workers unearthed the whiskey barrel while working on the construction of the Rawlins National Bank in Wyoming. Inside, they found Parrott's skull, still missing its top, along with other remains. Lillian Heath, who was by then in her mid-80s, was contacted. When she was sent a photograph of the skull, she recognized it immediately and sent her skull cap to match. To everyone's amazement, it fit perfectly. Subsequent DNA testing confirmed that the remains were indeed parrots. The story of George Parrott is an odd mix of crime, science, and human curiosity. Today, Governor Osborne's shoes are on display at the Carbon County Museum in Rawlins, along with the bottom portion of Parrott's skull and his earless death mask. These remnants of an outlaw's life have become items of historical fascination. However, one item is notably missing: the medicine bag created from Parrot's skin, which has never been found, leaving one final mystery in the story of this extraordinary man's posthumous fame. As we close the chapter on these infamous figures, it's clear that the legends of the Old West are far more than just tales of lawlessness. They represent a time when courage, recklessness, and rebellion collided in an unforgiving landscape. While many of these outlaws met their end by the hand of justice, their names have lived on, cemented in history as icons of a bygone era. If you've enjoyed this journey through the wild lives of these legendary outlaws, don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating stories about the untamed history of the American Old West. Stay tuned for the next thrilling chapter, and remember, the West may be long gone, but its tales are forever alive.